Probably one of the biggest misunderstandings that occurred over the last 20 years, maybe longer, is the role of estradiol, how important it is in women's health, actually also in men's health, but particularly we're talking about in women's health. When women have lots of estradiol during their childbearing years, they're very cardioprotected, and that's because estradiol actually signals and protects the anti-inflammatory glycans that are produced. And when you lose estradiol at menopause, well, you make more pro-inflammatory glycans, and guess what happens? Heart disease risk goes up. More women die of heart disease than men because they've got more pro-inflammatory signaling that's going on. So one role of estradiol is the fact that it's kind of anti-inflammatory. Estradiol helps protect your bones, helps with mood. Estradiol is important in monthly cycle regulation, right? It, in combination with progesterone, creates kind of the rhythm of monthly cycle in women that's important for reproduction. One of the big things that happened was the Women's Health Initiative kind of called out that estrogen can be bad and you don't need to replace estrogen. It could be dangerous if you're postmenopausal, or the dangers of supporting the body with estradiol during, perimenopause when, a woman's cycle is starting to become irregular. Well, not to get into the nuances of it, like if you're estrogen dominant, in PCOS, is that an issue? But just for general health, it turns out that when they looked at that study, they were using equine estrogen or Premarin. But even then, the risks that they kind of bucketed into the estrogen component, heart disease risk and, potential for clots and cancer risks, most of that ended up, when they looked at all the data, Department of Health and Human Services and FDA, released all those warnings and said, hey, we were wrong. We need to get rid of that thought, was because that medroxyprogestins, or the synthetic progesterones, were the ones that were really creating the problem. And then in fact, when women were taking estrogens, that they were actually had lived longer and in many cases had less frequency. Now, there's complications to this because you also make, when you say estrogen, you make estradiol, you make estrone, and you make estriol. We know that you want to make more estradiol than estrone. And we also know that when you metabolize estrogen, it needs to be metabolized into kind of a friendly package versus unfriendly estrogens. So when you make unfriendly estrogens, which is typically due to changes in the way you're metabolizing estrogen, which could be you've got beneficial floras off, you're therefore making more beta-glucuronidase, you can't carry the estrogen out of your body, or the fact that you're not metabolizing the estrogen, completely, that can start to create disruption. So is estrogen dominance an issue? Well, sure, you can gain weight on estrogen dominance. You can feel agitated on estrogen dominance. You could have, when women first start with, any kind of estrogen replacement. I know, one of the first clinics that I had when I worked at Good Sam Hospitals with Dr. Maureen Pelletier. She wrote The Idiot's Guide to Menopause. We were working with bioidentical hormones back in the late 90s because she was a forerunner in it, and I was lucky. I was her partner in practice, and I sat in on a lot of these women's hormone cases, and it really became evident that it's not just about how much estrogen you're making or where your estradiole's at, but it's also the balance that's occurring between estradiol, estrone, and progesterone. That these three hormones either create a symphony or they wreak havoc. So depending on the balance between those hormones, that's where you could see, gee, I've got, I'm getting fibroids because I'm estrogen dominant. Or in the case of PCOS, you're making too much testosterone and too much estrogen. And then any other kind of symptoms that are estrogen related, right? Because there are, ovarian cancers, uterine cancers, breast cancer. But the bottom line is that it's when these hormones are out of balance that we start to see a lot of these issues. The other piece that I think is important is realizing it, even in the case of breast cancer, where, obviously there's a lot of still, testing for genes related to estrogen receptor sensitivity. Typically, what you see in a lot of, breast cancer cases is there's an association with autoimmune thyroiditis, insulin resistance. There's other factors that are driving that process. And so I think probably the last piece that's not really all that aware is that estradiol actually is intimately involved in keeping efficiency in your mitochondrial function. So mitochondrial health, big topic now. How your body makes energy, or your mitochondria leaking electrons out of that process of making energy, creating oxidative damage. All of those aspects kind of play into this role of the importance of estradiol. Look, all you have to do is talk to a woman who is entering menopause, and they will tell you. And I remember sitting in the room with Dr. Pelletier, and it's, yes, I'm getting hot flashes. Then there's urinary incontinence. Guys, I'm leaking urine. It's embarrassing, which could be that your pelvic floor is dropped. It's a combination of the need for estrogens and testosterone for the pelvic floor. It's, man, my mood changed. Why do I feel so agitated and on edge? It's that loss of hormone production. I'm just not thinking as clear. And then the most important one is, I think, at least from what women, come back and they said was, I'm gaining weight. One of the reasons is when you stop making estradiol, that woman at menopause is still making estrone. And estrone ends up, especially when the estradiol is not present, is start to gain weight with that estrone production. Probably one of the biggest misunderstandings that are out there. I am so happy that, we finally got governmental agencies to reverse their thought process on this and really liberate women to be able to, utilize estradiol and get the most out of their health as they're aging.